I've been here so many times, but I always want to make an entrance on this stage. Thank you, Maria. Thank you to the foundation. It is a pleasure to be back again. Yes, you get back when the conversation is good, when the climate is nice, and the intellectual climate is stimulating. So that's a very good reason to be back. Thank you so much for inviting me again. And thank you also to Deusto and Grupo Planeta for publishing my book. I'm delighted to see it published in Spanish, not just because it is a great readership audience. My Spanish readers are some of the best readers I know. Also because it has a new title, because the old title, when it came in English, was Peak Human. And every single person who heard about that title thought that it was a book about exercise and how to stay in shape, how to get those miles and do the exercise and sleep well, and so on. And I will never forget when a colleague of my editor said that if they do think it is about exercise, it'll sell better than if they know it's about history. So we stuck to that title, but I think the Spanish one is probably more accurate. On the other hand, it is a book about how to stay in shape, but not as an individual, but as a society and a culture. How to make sure that you stay creative, how you stay dynamic, how you stay being innovative and growing. Because that is a challenge. Just like human beings need some exercise to stay in shape, we can never stop, because if we do, we will lag behind. It's the same thing with cultures and civilizations. We can never get too comfortable. We constantly have to renew the engines of innovation and of progress. So that's why I wrote this book about golden ages, about moments in history when societies managed to build success, growth and innovation, and what made that possible. So the question then obviously is, what is a golden age? What do I mean when I talk about great cultures? I'm not thinking about big empires as such. I'm not referring to territorial expansion, because in that case, Russia, when they're trying to invade their neighbors, might seem like a great civilization. Well, it's not if it doesn't create golden conditions for people in those societies. So what I'm thinking about is something else, what we're all trying to strive for today. How we can create cultural creativity, scientific curiosity, technological innovation, and economic growth. Golden ages are episodes in history when we had a large number of innovations in different spheres and sectors at the same time, thereby creating better living standards and opportunities for most people who lived there. Not for everybody. And that we have to remind ourselves of that always when we talk about history. The conditions for most people throughout history has been one of poverty and of oppression, and that goes even for the best societies in history. Mary Beard, the classicist who's an expert on the Roman Empire, she often finds that when she talks to an audience, there are so many people who envy the Roman Empire. They would have wanted to live there. Wouldn't that have been magnificent? Then she realizes that they all think that they would have been senators in Rome, or even emperors in Rome, which are a few hundred people in that civilization. Much more likely, unfortunately, that they would have been destitute, farmers, or even slaves in somebody's household or a mine. So we have to remember that most civilizations throughout history have engaged in slavery, territorial conquest, and they've given women few, if any, rights. However, we can't be too relativistic about it, because that's not what the neighbors saw when they looked to Rome or to Athens. It's not that they saw, oh, they have a lot of oppression over there and slavery, because they had that back home as well. Everybody did back in those days. What set Rome apart and what the neighbors realized was that for a brief moment in time, they managed to lift more people out of that and giving them more opportunities and more prosperity. And that's the key. Why did that happen? And to try to find out, let me give you a brief tour around the world about these 7 cultures that I'm looking at in this book, to get a sense of what we're looking for. So let's start in Athens, almost 2,500 years ago. The small but powerful Greek city-state that gave us concepts of philosophy and of democracy. And I would argue the very idea of intellectual innovation, because there had been innovative societies before. We've had in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, the Phoenician merchants, they were all very innovative, but to get some legitimacy for their ideas, for their novel ideas, technologies, and business models, they always had to pretend that this was an old idea. That was how you made ideas succeed. You said that this is something that our ancestors knew about, and then we forgot about it, but now we're back. However, the Athenians were the first to say that it's okay, it's acceptable, it's even virtuous to look at the world in a new way, to see something new, to find the patterns of nature or of humans, and to talk about it and to explain your discoveries to others. So when Aristotle talked about his teacher, Plato, and said that we have to celebrate and cherish our teachers and friends, but also the truth. The truth is also important. And if they are in conflict, we have to choose truth. That was a novel moment in intellectual history, because that's the first time it's legitimate. It's okay to say that the ancestors were wrong, and even the teachers are wrong, because I've seen something else over here. And when that spirit pervades a culture, then you will see extraordinary things happening in other places as well. In sculpture, in architecture, shipbuilding, in creating drama, which they did for the first time in Athens, and possibly most importantly, they created the science of history, without which we couldn't learn from history, with Herodotus and Thucydides. So that's why I start with Athens. The second culture that I write about is one that learned a lot from Athens, and that's Rome, the Roman Republic, and the early Roman Empire. In the centuries before Christ and a few afterwards, which is quite extraordinary. Have you been thinking about Rome today? Hands up, anyone? You know this meme on TikTok and social media? Apparently, especially men think about Rome all the time. And there was one guy, he's a Roman reenactor dressing up as a legionnaire. He said that ask your husband or your boyfriend or your brother how often he thinks about Rome. You will be surprised. And they were, and lots of people, they filmed the reactions about it. Some people said that, oh, I think about it some 4 or 5 times a day. There's so much to think about. I actually talked to this guy, Gaius Flavius, the Roman reenactor, and asked him, so how often do you think about Rome? And he said, only once. But it begins when I wake up and it ends when I go to bed at night. And his point was that there are so many things that we still have in our world today that are a legacy of the Romans. From Roman law and so many concepts coming from Latin in legal professions, and the Latin languages obviously, and the Christian church in the Catholic and Orthodox varieties, and our ways of building cities, the urban grid, and our way of building buildings at all. Our calendar, our so many ways of looking at the world originated in in Rome in this way, because they built this huge integrated empire where when one idea appeared somewhere, it could rapidly appear elsewhere as well. So while they might not have been as innovative as the Athenians, if anyone anywhere stumbled onto a new idea, it rapidly traveled over all the roads that led to Rome and the Mediterranean, which was in effect a Roman lake. Another culture that learned from the Romans and actually considered itself the ancestors of Rome. I'm not thinking of Eastern Rome, I'm thinking of the Abbasid Caliphate here in Baghdad, the capital that they built in the late 8th century. This was a new empire that integrated through commerce and one system of law the whole region from northern Africa all the way over the Middle East, all the way to Central Asia and to Afghanistan. And thereby creating lots of prosperity, becoming the richest civilization on the planet some 1,200 years ago, but also the most scientifically curious and the most technologically innovative civilization of its time. Because it was. And this is in stark contrast to many of the states that are now in that region. Intellectually tolerant. They invited everybody, of every faith and of every region, to come to Baghdad and to other cities and to tell them what they have seen. Because they had the idea that to block out facts and science is to block out the kingdom of God. So they could make use of more people's ideas and science and build something on top of that. That's, by the way, why Baghdad looked like that, at least in the recreations that we have. It's built as a perfect circle in honor of the caliph's favorite geometrician, Euclid. You might have other favorite geometricians, but this was his, and this was his way of honoring a thriving commercial city full of shops and of bookshops. We don't have to go further than the letter A to see how much of intellectual debt we have to that Arab civilization. We have algebra, we've got algorithm, we have got arithmetics, all Arab words, and by the way, speaking of Arab numbers, is also something we got from there, which made it easier to do calculations and arithmetics. Ironically, we also have alcohol from Arabic. But then obviously we became the experts when it comes to that. And that's what culture is about. It's about learning and adapting what the discoveries of other civilizations. The only competitor in those days to the Abbasid Caliphate was on the other side of the globe, on the other side of the Silk Road, and that was China. You know, Karl Marx, founder of socialism, he claimed that the very thing that ushered in the rule of the bourgeoisie were three novel innovations. It was the magnetic compass, it was gunpowder, and it was the printing press. But of course, they weren't novel at all. The Chinese had it all 1,000 years ago. And they were remarkably innovative during the Song dynasty in the 11th, 12th, and 13th century. That was the moment when they really thrived. And what was going on back then was that they had a new dynasty that created stability, civilian control of the armies and the warlords, and then established a system of more of rule of law than they had had under other dynasties. And this meant that they provided farmers with property rights, so that farmers could begin to experiment with new crops. So old luxury crops like tea and rice that normal Chinese had never tasted, they suddenly became the cheap consumer goods because these farmers started to experiment and innovate. And with the help of paper money, they created a commercialized economy, an agricultural revolution that led to urbanization, lots of people moving to cities, and those cities exploded in a more commercialized trade society, and they came up with novelties, new textile machines, a production of iron and steel that Europe wouldn't surpass in total until the 18th century, probably. Some economic historians claim that the Chinese back then, in the 13th century, were close to unleashing an industrial revolution, 500 years before the British did. And some intellectual historians claim that they were even close to unleashing, with novel philosophical and cultural ideas, a renaissance, a long time before the Italians came up with the same idea. But to get to a real renaissance, we have to go to the Renaissance, and that is our fifth culture. Renaissance Italy, 14th, 15th century. What's happened there is that they are beginning to think that it's strange that we haven't been able to accomplish as much as our ancestors did during the Roman Empire, Athenian Republic. So why is that? What can we do? And then they heard about what was going on in China. Marco Polo venturing out there, telling them that they have extraordinary wealth, new materials, bigger ships, they have more trade. So shouldn't we be able to do something like that back home? They were always trading the North Italian merchant cities with the Arab cities. Even though that wasn't always popular with the Pope, they kept doing it because, as the saying went back then in Venice and Florence, here Florence, was that trade should be free all the way to the gates of hell, which I think is a great free trade slogan, should be a T-shirt in these days of trade wars around the world. Because what they picked up was not just more wealth than others. They also picked up new ideas, new ways of, new financial innovations, and Arabic numerals that make double entry bookkeeping possible, and with the Medici banks and financial revolutions, they also made more trade and discoveries possible, and also engaged in conspicuous consumption in the arts. Because if you have social mobility, it's not enough just to talk about your ancestors, you have to prove yourself and show what you are about. And one way of doing that is to ask Michelangelo to do a sculpture for you, or Leonardo da Vinci to make a portrait. So the Renaissance then gives us many of those extraordinary masterpieces. But obviously the Renaissance is cut short by the Italian War, by religious conflict, by the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, and most of Europe ends up in major, disastrous wars. The one part of Europe that makes it out and becomes a link between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment is the Dutch Republic. In the 16th century, a part of the Spanish Habsburg Empire, and they are learning from the Spanish about ideals, about individual rights and free markets from the school of Salamanca, and they are using those ideas to set themselves free from Spain during an 80-year-long war against the Habsburg dynasty. And the most remarkable thing is that nobody expects them to win, right? Because they have nothing. They don't have a monarchy, no strong aristocracy. They don't even have land on which to stand and grow crops. But that forces them to become more innovative and to open their economies and their universities to refugees from everywhere else. So they get people with skills, with new financial knowledge, with and some of the greatest scholars that will unleash the Enlightenment, like Spinoza, Descartes, and John Locke. None of them from the Netherlands, but all of them ending up there, having fled from Spinoza's family from Portugal, Descartes from France, John Locke from England, because at this point in time, the Dutch Republic is most open to new ideas, and they managed to come out of the war being the richest economy on the planet and with the biggest empire around the world. And a remarkable golden era with Rembrandt, Vermeer, artists like that. And they also do something that's somewhat forgotten. The greatest thing the Dutch ever did was to invade England in 1688, because they constantly felt threatened by England and France, worried about the next war. So they thought the one thing we can do to protect ourselves is, in 1688, to try to invade our arch enemy, England, and try to transplant our own ideals into that bigger body politic. And they succeed. William of Orange, not just an invader, but also invited by parts of the British Parliament who wants his help against the Stuart monarchs. And it ends up being a quick and fairly successful revolution, rapidly rebranded as the Glorious Revolution by the English, saying that this is the time when we got back our ancient rights against our king. And obviously it's more complex than that. But the interesting thing is that this is the start of the Anglo sphere, which I think is kind of the era that we still live in, or at least lived in until quite recently. Because now those Dutch ideals that were the school of Salamanca ideas in Spain about restraining the rights of executive government power, of free markets, of property rights, and of trade, they now become British ideals. And when the British lose their North American colonies, they become American ideals. And then, in that vast continental power, which, with a remarkable set of entrepreneurial talents and innovative capacities, they become the mightiest power on the planet, and after the Second World War, building a world order with the help of other democracies around the world that made the world safe for, I would argue, Dutch and Salamanca ideals. And that's the world we're still in, hopefully, about trying to, for all its perfections, it was a world order in which we tried to solve conflicts through negotiations rather than gunboats, with trade that was free, communication that was free, open seas, that made it possible for more countries than ever before to not constantly look around the shoulder to see whether their neighbors were going to attack them, and instead focus their energies on creating more knowledge, more capacity, more wealth. And that's why we're in the first golden era that's not just regional by nature, but for the first time, it is global. For the first time, we've seen effects throughout the world. And in these past 200 years, we've probably reduced extreme poverty from almost 90% of the world population to less than 10% today. We've increased life expectancy from some 30 years back then to 74 years today. This is a remarkable golden age, if we can keep it. So our ancestors would definitely look at this and say that this is quite extraordinary compared to anything that we could achieve. So what is going on here? What have we seen? If we just look at these 7 golden ages, and if my editor had been more generous, I would have included more civilizations. But only these 7 shows us that we can't explain golden ages with geography, because the center of progress keeps changing, keeps moving around the world throughout history. We can't explain it with religion, because we've been looking at pagans and Catholics and Calvinists and Muslims and Confucians and Anglicans and seculars. So it's more about how they held those ideals. Did they do it in those faiths? Did they do it in a way that built an orthodoxy and you didn't accept any kind of discovery or innovation from elsewhere? Or did you do it in a way that made it possible to keep on learning, keep on growing? Because that's the key to building golden ages. The 2 keys, the 2 secrets, if you want to build your own golden age, in your city, in your country, in your organization, your business, or even in your private life. I think there are two secrets, and that's imitation and innovation. You need both of them. First of all, looking at imitation, you know how hard it is to come up with a brand new idea that no one has ever thought about before? I try to do it all the time, but it's hard. It's much easier if you listen to the ideas of others and then you try to combine them in new ways. And that's what all these civilizations did. They were created at the crossroads between other civilizations. They were always learning. Merchant cultures that picked up new, not just goods and services, but new ideas, new methods from other places. Like the Athenians, not just between the Phoenicians and the Egyptians, but also neighboring another 1,000 Greek city-states. So they could always compare what they were doing and learn from the best. Obviously, they made a lot of war as well, but it made it possible for them to pick up new ideas, compare what they were doing to what others were doing. Or like the Romans did, up in the right corner, it's Emperor Claudius' text, when he tried to convince the Senate that now, after having fought the Gauls for 100 years, let's turn them into citizens, because that's the way to acquire talent and brains and hard work from those peoples. So the Romans were obviously brutal conquerors, but so were everyone back in those days. What made the Romans successful conquerors were that they were strategically tolerant. They constantly picked up new ideas from new places. So they knew that you can't rule a huge empire from one city. You have to give the provinces power, and you have to allow them to keep their property, their gods, their ideas. And then we'll pick up the best ideas and people from those places. Tolerance was not something that they engaged in because they were kind. They weren't. They truly enjoyed brutal conquest. But they did it because tolerance was a weapon. Diversity was a strength, literally. They picked up their ways of organizing their legions from the Etruscans. They picked up their shields from the Samnites. They picked up their Spanish swords from, well, the Spanish. The stabbing swords. They built an entire navy by looking at a shipwreck from Carthage. They even experimented with war elephants when Hannibal had attacked them with war elephants coming over the Alps. So they constantly learned from others, imitated, and so they became more powerful. Or in the bottom right, you can see that's supposed to be Hugo Grotius, the great Dutch legal thinker, natural rights theoretician, creator of international law, according to most textbooks. But as you can see, he got his ideas from Vitoria, from Suarez, and from other Spanish Dominican thinkers who had got some of their best ideas from Thomas of Aquinas, who got some of his best ideas from Averroes in Muslim Spain, who got his best ideas from Aristotle. So we are constantly learning, picking up the best ideas and removing the bad ones, and then constantly moving on. That's the first step to building success. The other one is innovation. Because once you have those new ingredients, you have to come up with new, better dishes. And that's hard. That's hard work as well. As Joel Mokyr, the economic historian who recently won the Nobel Prize in Economics, put it, every act of innovation is an act of rebellion against vested interests and common wisdom. Which means that if vested interests and common wisdom have veto power in a society, they will shut things down. Nothing much will happen. Why would a church that has built its power on one specific interpretation of nature accept new discoveries? Why would a guild system or a monopoly or a trade union that has built its economic power on particular production methods accept new experiments? Well, that's why we need freedom. That's why we need rule of law that restricts the government from picking winners, deciding who will get what, and instead establish systems where surprises are acceptable, where people are allowed to use their own property, their own work, in investing in new strange ideas and reap the rewards if they are successful. And that's what the Golden Ages did. This is a reason why Golden Ages are quite rare, because this is hard work. But some did, like in Athens, accepting freedom of speech, allowing people to speak their minds and being able to participate in new debates. Or like the steam engine that had existed elsewhere in Europe, but had been blocked by guilds, by traditional economic restrictions, but were allowed to be used and perfected in Britain and then unleashing the Industrial Revolution. Or here we've got two different ships. We've got the greatest Chinese ship under Hongzhi in the 14th century with the biggest tribute ships. They had a huge armada that could have discovered the world. And then the tiny ship over there, that's Santa Maria. That's Columbus' ship with which he discovered America. But the Chinese didn't discover the world. They didn't become rulers of the seas. Because in an authoritarian system, you'd better be lucky and get an emperor that's interested in progress and innovation. But in the long run, it's difficult to be successful with every new emperor. Eventually, they got a Ming emperor who just said, no, we want stability. So we will stop these commercial experiments, we will ban international trade, and we will tie the farmers to their land and force them to cultivate the same crops that they've always done. And the Chinese got stability, but they also got 500 years of stagnation. Whereas Europe was different. Here, when a crazy eccentric like Columbus had a new idea, let's go in the other direction. He could go to different counts in Italy to try to raise funds, and he was rejected. He could go to England, being rejected, going to France, was rejected, going to Portugal, and he was rejected, and then eventually to Isabel and Ferdinand, and he got his sponsorship, and then the rest is history. That's the difference. More decentralized systems make it possible for those rebellious acts of innovation to triumph compared to centralized systems. Then, if you have imitation and innovation, you might, if you're lucky, reach the next step. And that is building a culture of possibility, a culture of optimism. It's not all about institutions, it's about the very perception that change is possible, improvement and progress is possible. You need that, because innovation is hard. It is tricky. When we've found ways that work, we stick to that, usually. So we need those eccentrics. I always include nowadays a picture of the flying shuttle that made weaving much more productive during the Industrial Revolution, because it always puzzles technology historians. Why? Because it seems so simple. It didn't require any specific materials. It didn't require any specialized knowledge. As one historian puts it, every weaver throughout history should have been able to come up with a flying shuttle just through a process of trial and error. But for 5,000 years, nobody did. For 5,000 years. And that tells me that we're not that very innovative. We have to see other people around us who experiment and innovate and succeed and become fabulously wealthy and become role models. And that might encourage us to do the same thing. So it took the Industrial Revolution with experiments in steam engines and horseshoes and in hot air balloons to get weavers to think, oh, I might be able to improve this thing as well. Or the Renaissance, the great artists back then. You needed someone like Giotto of Florence who came up with new perspectives and depth in art. And then Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo could keep on perfecting those techniques. And you need some competition and rivalry as well You know, Leonardo and Michelangelo, they didn't like one another. Michelangelo complained that Leonardo was a great procrastinator who never finished his great works, whereas Leonardo said, oh, but your muscular, strange figures, they don't look like muscle men, it looks like sacks of walnuts. And I think they both had a point, but more importantly, that very rivalry spurred them to achieve more. So this, I think, is a reason why we often have clusters in history. You know, philosophers in Athens and painters and in Florence and tech guys in Silicon Valley, classical music in Vienna and so on and so on. Because you have to look at those role models, someone to learn from, to get inspired from, and to cooperate with and to compete with. That's a culture of optimism, and that creates a golden age. Which brings us to the most depressing question there is. If it's so great, if it's so magnificent, why do these cultures all eventually decline and fall? And that's complicated. One German historian in 1984 tried to collect all the reasons that had been mentioned for the fall of Rome. He ended up with a list of 210 different reasons. So it's somewhat over-explained. So from barbarian invasions to inflation and lead poisoning to sadness and gout, apparently. So many factors can play a role in the decline and fall. But I go with the historian Somerville, who pointed out that cultures don't die of old age, they die of murder or of suicide. So either they're killed from the outside, and that could be invasions, or it could be natural disasters, and that sometimes happens. At the same time, you can bounce back from such disasters. You can beat back the invaders, you can rebuild cities, the survivors after a huge pandemic can keep going. However, it's much more difficult to bounce back from suicide if you've decided that you've given up. And that's something we see throughout history as well, that sometimes cultures lose their cultural self-confidence. They lose that spark, that culture of optimism that kept them going. And instead, they begin to try to protect the old ways, stifle innovation, and in that case, their pessimism becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think that there are two specific psychological seeds of decline that's always present in every civilization, but at times it might ruin it completely. The first one is complacency, being too comfortable. Once you've managed to get something done, you stick to it. Once you have this wealth, you're comfortable, you're happy with it. You think more about how to consume the results than about how to create more of it in the long run. And then you forget the institutions, the novelties that are needed to regenerate and keep it going. So often you build layers of special interests that protect the old systems, layers of regulations, and you try to live beyond your means. So traditionally you debase the coinage, put bad metal into the gold and silver, and you raise debts that you're not able to repay in the long run. This is the sort of death by comfort that sometimes happens, and then other hungrier cultures in the vicinity might be able to outcompete you completely. The other tendency is panic and fear, which seems like the opposite, right? You're comfortable or you're terrified, but they both make you forget why you got here, the institutions and the hard work that it took to get here. Because when we end up in fear and panic, and that sometimes happens when you face all those horrible sort of the invaders, the pandemics, the natural disasters. Something that often happens is that societies panic and just think, oh, let's hand power to one big leader, to one strong man, to the big government just to protect us. Let's skip all this intellectual debate and let's just move on with it. And let's find scapegoats like Socrates and sentence him to death because we don't want troublemakers anymore. And then that also becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy because while the world is a dangerous place and it is scary out there, what's needed to solve and deal with those problems is not just to escape from it all and try to hide from it. It's to be more innovative, to learn more, to come up with better ideas on how to innovate our ways around it. But when you panic, you're not thinking clearly, you're not learning from history, you're not paying attention. And that's why I would like to end with the real lesson of history. And this comes from Thucydides, 2,300 years ago, the ancient Greek historian, who pointed out that there are two different mentalities in the world. It's the Athenian, constantly venturing out abroad, traveling to far distant places to try to pick up new ideas and acquire new methods and wealth. And it's the Spartan, staying at home to try to protect what he already has. And both of these mentalities can play a valuable role at times, but broadly speaking, you have to be an Athenian if you want to build a golden age. You have to learn more, you have to be more adaptive and more innovative. And I think Thucydides' point is that every culture, every civilization has a little bit of the Athenian and the Spartan within. And so do we all. We have them over here, and they appear at different times. So we are Athenian and we are Spartan, but we decide who we let out. Thank you.